Imagine you are standing on the shore of Ithaca around 1200 BCE. Salt wind from the Mediterranean cuts against your face. Before you is not a white stone palace or a hero draped in a cloak, but a field torn apart in chaos. The earth is ripped open. White salt scatters across the soil like ash, and at the center of it all, a man is doing something no one else would dare to do. He has yoked an ox and a donkey to the same wooden plow, two animals that will never pull in rhythm. They strain against each other, veering off course, bellowing in pain. The man staggers behind them, gripping the plow handle, screaming nonsense, his eyes rolled back like a madman. With his free hand, he keeps flinging salt into his own land. Salt kills soil. Salt turns fields into graveyards. To anyone watching, the message is unmistakable. The king has lost his mind. That is exactly what the soldiers need to believe. They have come from every Greek kingdom, carrying a single command: all kings must sail. An oath was sworn years earlier when Helen was taken from Sparta, an oath dressed up as honor, now tightened into a noose. No one is allowed to stand aside. No one is allowed to say no. The man behind the plow understands this. He knows that if he wants to stay, he must become useless. A madman is not counted as an ally. A madman is not dragged into war. So he performs. He destroys himself in front of them, deliberately, methodically. But Palamedes, the man sent to judge him, does not trust performances that are too perfect. He steps closer, studies the ruined field, the uneven steps, the salt sinking into the earth. And then he does something no one expects. He grabs the newborn from the nurse's arms. There is no warning, no pause. The infant is hurled straight into the furrow, directly in the path of the advancing blade. The small body hits the ground like a piece of soft flesh. A cry erupts, thin, sharp, slicing through the sea wind. Time freezes. If the man is truly mad, he will keep going. The plow will pass over the child. The performance will be complete, but his hands tighten, muscles lock. In that brief instant, everything he tried to conceal is laid bare: fear, clarity, and the instinct of a father. He jerks the plow hard. The ox and the donkey veer apart. The iron blade slices into the soil just inches away. Dirt explodes upward. The child lives. Everyone understands. The act is over. From that moment on, history often paints Odysseus as a coward, a king who feigned madness to avoid war, a man afraid to die. But that story is told by people who never looked directly at the world they were living in. The year 1200 BCE was not an ordinary time. Later historians would call it the Bronze Age collapse. But for those who lived through it, it was not a theory. It was reality. Trade routes are breaking down. Food is growing scarce. Cities are burning from Anatolia to the Levant. The Hittite Empire is falling. Mycenaean centers are disintegrating. The so-called sea peoples appeared along the coasts, raiding not by season, but out of desperation. Odysseus saw this early, not in prophecy, but in ships that never returned, in harbors gone silent, in the eyes of merchants lying about lost cargo. He understood something few dared to admit: the world was dying. And in a world like that, war does not create heroes. It creates corpses. The expedition ahead was not a romantic crusade. It was a massive act of predation. Greek warlords scrambling for what remained of a collapsing system. Leaving Ithaca now meant abandoning the island to raiders. It meant turning his wife and child into prey the moment his sails vanished over the horizon. So Odysseus did the only sane thing left. He tried to stay, not out of cowardice, but out of clarity. He was willing to be mocked, willing to salt his own fields, willing to sacrifice honor to protect what mattered. But that world did not tolerate those who saw too clearly. When he saved his son, he condemned himself. Soldiers seized him without orders, without justification. He had proven he was still sane, and that meant he had to go. As the sound of waves swallowed the cries of the child behind him, Odysseus understood one thing with brutal certainty: from this moment on, he had no choices left. He was stepping into a war whose end would not be glory, but the slow destruction of the human soul. And there, in that salted field, the image of the Greek hero began to crack, not under sword or spear, but under the weight of a father who dared to show the truth in an age of collapse. Clarity is the greatest crime of all. The ship left Ithaca in silence. There were no cheers, no banners, only the groan of wood under the weight of men who had been forced to go. Odysseus stood at the prow, watching the island recede, grow smaller, blur into the distance, as if it already belonged to another life. He did not turn back. Turning back would change nothing, except to make the pain sharper. No one on that ship believed they were sailing because of Helen. Her name could be spoken in speeches, dressed up as honor, as an oath, as an unforgivable insult. But in the eyes of those men, Odysseus saw only one thing: reluctance forced to wear the costume of righteousness. The Trojan War did not begin because of a woman. It began at the moment kings understood they were no longer allowed to say no. The oath had been sworn years earlier at a time when the world was still held together by a fragile calm. The lords had gathered not to prepare for war, but to prevent it. They swore to defend the marriage of the chosen man, to stop bloodshed born of rivalry. But an oath, once spoken before the gods, never stays where it is born. It lives. It grows. And when circumstances change, it becomes something else. Now that oath was no longer a matter of honor. It was a contract of coercion. There were no clauses for withdrawal, no exceptions. Those who refused did not need to be punished in public. This world did not require loud executions. It only needed a few accidents at the right moment, a few small cities left undefended, a few ships that never made it back to harbor. The message would spread on its own. Odysseus understood this mechanism perfectly. Even before Palamedes set foot on Ithaca, the rumors had arrived first. A hesitant king in the north died during a hunting trip. An island that declared neutrality was stripped bare by pirates until there was nothing left to take. No one claimed responsibility. No one needed to ask. Palamedes was not cruel in the ordinary sense. He did not kill for pleasure or personal ambition. Palamedes believed in order, and in his mind, order mattered more than individual lives. An alliance survives only when no one is allowed to break discipline. Odysseus, with his clarity that refused to bend, was a threat, not because he was strong, but because he could think differently. That was why Palamedes came to Ithaca, not to invite, but to test. And the trial in the salted field was never about whether Odysseus was mad. It was about whether he still possessed enough humanity to be used. When Odysseus saved his son, Palamedes knew there was no alternative. A father like that, once dragged into war, would not fight for another man's glory. He would fight for himself, and that made it impossible for him to leave behind. On the ship cutting through the waves, Odysseus looked at the men around him. Agamemnon moved like someone accustomed to giving orders and being obeyed. Menelaus remained quiet humiliation, still weighing down every step. Other kings, smaller leaders, each carried his own reasons for convincing himself that this voyage was necessary. But beneath all those layers of justification lay the same truth: if they did not go, they would lose everything. This was not a volunteer army. It was a collection of armed hostages. War in this form resembled a gang more than a crusade. Once you stepped in, there was no way out. To leave you first had to disappear from the map. Odysseus said nothing. He knew any protest now was meaningless. The game had been designed without alternatives. The only thing left was how to play it. He could feel clearly that the real war had not yet begun at Troy. It had already begun here on this deck, in the way each man would adapt to the truth that he no longer controlled his own fate. When Ithaca finally vanished beyond the horizon, Odysseus understood that he had crossed an invisible line. From that moment on, he was no longer the man trying to avoid war. He had become part of it. And he understood one more thing, cold and unavoidable, in a war built on coercion. The last one to survive is rarely the one who follows the rules. The ship drove toward the horizon, And as the distance between Ithaca and the prow slowly widened, Odysseus slipped into a silence that belonged only to him, not the silence of fear, nor of despair. It was the silence of a man accustomed to retracing his own life whenever he knew there would be no way back from what lay ahead. He was not surprised to find himself here. If he were honest, Odysseus had always known this day would come sooner or later. Men like him are rarely allowed to live quietly for long. The world has a habit of dragging them into the light precisely when they are most eager to disappear into the dark. Odysseus had never been raised to be a model king. In his memory, the most important lessons did not come from thrones or councils, but from stories told half in jest around the fire. They were not about honor, but about escape, not about victory, but about how not to be found. His grandfather Autolycus was that kind of man, a figure whose reputation traveled farther than his shadow. No one could say with certainty what land he had ruled, but everyone knew his name was tied to vanished herds, emptied storehouses without a trace, theft so clean the victims did not even know whom to blame because there was no evidence left to cling to. Autolycus did not oppose the law. He simply stepped around it quietly like water slipping through stone. Odysseus grew up on stories like these. He learned to observe before acting, to understand what people wanted before listening to what they said. In Autolycus's world, the honest man usually died young. The clever man lived even if no one ever applauded his survival. One day when Odysseus was still young, that lesson was carved into him, not with words, but with flesh and blood. On the slopes of Mount Parnassus, during what seemed like an ordinary hunt, he encountered a wild boar. There was nothing heroic about the moment. No horns, no formation, just a mass of muscle bursting from the brush, too fast, too close. The impact came before thought. The tusk tore into his thigh, unleashing a raw, primitive pain that made every idea of courage meaningless. Odysseus killed the animal, but the cost was nearly his life. He lay there amid the smell of blood and damp earth, grasping a truth so simple. It was brutal. Nature does not care who you are. It does not reward bravery. It only punishes carelessness. The scar it left was not beautiful. It did not resemble the marks warriors proudly display. It was ugly, jagged, and whenever the weather changed, it burned as if to remind him. From that day on, Odysseus understood that facing danger head-on was not a measure of worth. Survival was the only measure that could not be argued away. With that understanding, he watched the men around him on the ship heading for Troy. And no one could fail to notice Achilles. Achilles seemed like a creature that stepped straight out of the stories children grew up hearing. Everything about him was direct strength, speed, rage. When Achilles laughed, others laughed with him. When Achilles walked onto the battlefield, people believed the outcome was already decided. There was an aura around him that others could only borrow by standing nearby. Odysseus looked at Achilles, not with envy, but with cold clarity. He knew men like Achilles were born for brilliant moments, but such moments rarely last. The world they were sailing toward was not made for light. It was a place of dust disease, waiting, and bad decisions made in the dark. Achilles would win the battles people remembered. Odysseus would have to live through the things no one wanted to remember. That difference did not make Odysseus weaker. It made him dangerous. While others talked about how to attack, he thought about how to withdraw. While they debated honor, he calculated consequences, not because he was a coward, but because he had seen too many of the bravest men fall to the smallest things, an infected wound, a stray arrow, a single unguarded night. The most dangerous man is not the strongest one. The most dangerous man is the one who understands the world is unfair and does not demand that it be fair to survive. Odysseus did not enter this war hoping to become a legend. He entered with a far humbler goal: to survive long enough to find a way home, if that way still existed. As the ship continued eastward across the waves, Odysseus knew that what he carried with him was not strength meant to overwhelm, but another kind of weapon, rougher, less celebrated, but far more enduring. The ability to endure pain, to inflict pain, and to keep moving forward in a world where those who rely on strength alone are rarely the ones who survive to the end. The ships reached the shores of the Troad on a morning that felt unremarkable. No thunder, no omens, only a long stretch of coastline, low fields, and in the distance the gray stone walls of Troy towering and silent as if they had stood there long before any of these men were born. No one said it aloud, but from that moment Odysseus knew this place would not fall quickly. The early days passed with a forced eagerness. Leaders spoke of victories to come. Warriors sharpened their weapons, believing that a few great battles would be enough to send them home with spoils and stories. But Troy refused to play that role. The gates did not open. The defenders did not rush out to satisfy anyone's sense of honor. They stayed behind the walls, watched, waited, and let time do its work. Weeks turned into months. Months stretched into years. Troy did not fall because it could not be taken head on. Its walls were too thick, too high built, not only of stone, but of patience. Each time the Greeks tried to force an assault, they paid a price, not in great defeats, but in small, steady losses, insignificant if counted day by day, devastating when added together. A stray arrow, a stone dropped from above, a soldier who never rose again after being wounded. But the most dangerous deaths did not come from Troy's walls. They came from the Greek camp itself. Disease spread faster than any formation. Drinking water turned foul. Meat rotted under the sun. Flies and mosquitoes breed in stagnant pools. Men began to die, not by sword or spear, but by fever, by dysentery, by pains with no enemy to hate. They died in their tents, surrounded by sweat and despair, unseen, unsung, never remembered in the songs that would come later. Boredom killed faster than sickness. There were no battles to anticipate, no ending to cling to. Every morning looked like the one before it. Every sunset carried the same unspoken question: how much longer will we be here? Men began to quarrel over trivial things. Honor was eroded not by defeat, but by prolonged meaninglessness. Odysseus watched all of this in silence. He was not surprised. This was the kind of war he had feared from the beginning. No climax, no decisive moment. Only time slowly grinding down. Everything men believed mattered. He could see clearly that Troy was winning not through strength, but by forcing its enemy to rot from within. In the early years, Achilles was still a storm. When he appeared on the battlefield, Troy paid for it. Those clashes became rare points of light moments, when the Greeks could still believe that strength meant something. Achilles struck fast, struck hard, struck directly, and he won. But even Achilles could not break the walls. He could only kill those who dared to step outside them. Gradually, even that storm began to lose its effect. Troy learned to avoid Achilles. They refused to meet him head-on. They waited until he withdrew, then countered elsewhere. Achilles' strength became predictable, and in war, anything predictable is already on its way to being neutralized. Then Achilles died, not in a great battle as people like to imagine, not amid cheers and admiring eyes. He fell to an arrow, a brief lapse, a small weakness that a lifetime of strength could not hide. When the news spread through the camp, no one cried out. The silence was worse, because in that death, everyone saw themselves. If Achilles could die, then no one was untouchable. That was the moment strength went bankrupt. Honor speeches began to sound hollow. Promises of victory lost their grip. Troy still stood there, intact, cold, a mockery that stretched on for nearly a decade. For Odysseus, Achilles' death was more than the loss of a warrior. It marked the end of a way of thinking. The path of direct confrontation had been tried, and it had failed, not for lack of courage, but because it had been wrong from the start. Troy was not an enemy that could be crushed by brute force. It was a different kind of problem, one that demanded a solution no one had yet dared to voice. For the first time, Odysseus allowed himself to imagine an ending that was not clean, not beautiful, not worthy of heroic songs. An ending that would disgust many, if it succeeded, but would end 10 years of decaying of Hawaii in a single night. He did not share the thought with anyone. It was too new, too dangerous, but it had taken root in councils while others still argued over who deserved command, who had been insulted, who owed vengeance, to whom Odysseus remained silent. He looked at the exhausted faces, the hollow eyes, the hands trembling from sleeplessness and fading hope. This was no longer an army chasing glory. These were men desperate for an exit, any exit. 10 years had passed. No victory, no return. Only time, heat disease, and slow death. Troy did not need to defeat them. It only needed to wait. And in that waiting, Odysseus understood that if the war continued along the same path, it would end neither in victory nor defeat, but in the complete unraveling of everything they had carried from home. As night settled over the camp once more, Odysseus looked toward Troy's walls, dark against the moonlight. He no longer saw them as a challenge of honor. He saw them as a locked door. And if a door could not be broken from the outside, then perhaps there was only one option left: to find a way to open it from within, no matter the cost. That night there were no war drums, no signal horns, no speeches, no oaths shouted into the dark. After 10 years of waiting, what remained in the Greek camp was not hunger for glory, but a fatigue so heavy it bordered on numbness. These men had grown used to waking up without knowing how today would differ from yesterday, and it was precisely in that exhaustion that the idea emerged, quiet, stripped bare, carrying none of the shape of a heroic deed. The horse was not born as a symbol. It was born as a question. Not a question for Troy, but for those who build it. If victory could not be taken by force, could it be taken through another people's faith? Odysseus did not speak much when the plan surfaced. He knew ideas like this, when framed as cunning, invited resistance. So he let it drift as a possibility, an escape everyone feared, but no one dared dismiss. An offering large enough to command attention, strange enough to provoke doubt, and sacred enough to make destruction feel dangerous. Not a weapon in the ordinary sense. Something else. Something aimed directly at fear and reverence at the same time. The horse was built in silence. Planks of wood fitted together piece by piece, rising higher than the heads of the men standing near it. The craftsmen did not ask questions. They had learned that questions at this stage often led to answers no one wanted to hear. When the shape finally stood complete, unease spread through the camp. It did not resemble any engine of war they had known. It looked like a challenge thrown directly at the gods. No one sang as the horse was dragged to the shore. No one stood at the prow, waving farewell. The fleet withdrew under cover of night, leaving behind an empty beach and a massive object standing alone before Troy's gates. From the walls, the Trojans looked down confused, and that confusion was the first opening. Arguments erupted inside the city. Some wanted it burned, some wanted it destroyed, but the inscription carved into the wood, the offering declared to Athena, stayed their hands. For 10 years, Troy had survived not only by its walls, but by its belief that the gods still favored it. To violate a sacred offering at the moment the war seemed finally over was a risk no one wanted to take. The gates opened not because they were broken, but because they were invited. It was the decisive moment, though no cheers accompanied it. The horse was pulled inside slowly, ceremonially, as if Troy itself were drawing the enemy into its heart. Odysseus did not witness this from within the city. He waited offshore, listening to the wind, knowing that, from this moment on, there was no way back. Night fell over Troy in wine and relief. 10 years of tension ended without further bloodshed, an ending rare enough to be believed. When the gates closed, Troy told itself it had won through endurance. No one knew that this victory was only the final mask before collapse. When the doors of the horse opened, there was no sacred light, no supernatural sign. Only men slipping out into the dark, one by one, silent, efficient, bearing no resemblance to the heroes of epic song. They did not seek challengers. They sought bolts and locks, sleeping guards, anything that could open a path for the army waiting outside. The gates of Troy opened for the second time that day, and this time not for celebration. There was no battle, no formation, no chance for Troy to organize. Streets turned into corridors of death. Men were killed in their sleep, on their doorsteps, in the places they believed were safest. Screams rose too late, tangled with the sound of metal striking stone and the smell of smoke spreading from burning roofs. Moral boundaries vanished faster than the smoke. Once the gates were open, everything beyond them became spoiled. Children were dragged from their beds. Women were seized amid cries and feral laughter. Pleas lost all meaning because no one felt the need to justify their actions anymore. War, restrained for 10 years, burst loose like an uncontrolled flood. Odysseus entered the city while the sky was still dark. He walked the streets he had seen only from afar for a decade. Walls that once symbolized invincibility were now smeared with blood. He did not shout. He did not raise his sword in a firelight. He walked, watched, and remembered. This was the result of a decision made in silence, and he understood his responsibility for everybody lying on the stone. When the first child was killed, for the sake of future risk, no one objected. The reasoning was too cold, too logical to argue with. If the child lived, it would grow. If it grew, it would seek revenge. And if it sought revenge, the cycle would begin again. The logic spread faster than fire, and soon it became doctrine. Once doctrine changes, nothing is impossible. Odysseus stood there amid fire and smoke, and for the first time he did not look away from the truth. He did not tell himself he had not wielded the blade. He did not blame the collective madness of war. He knew exactly this: without this plan, Troy might still stand. And if Troy still stood, the next 10 years would be even worse. But knowing the reason did not lighten the burden. He looked at the dying city, not as a victor, but as a man who had broken something beyond repair. This was not merely the fall of a fortress. It was the collapse of a way of believing in the world. Troy had trusted that walls, gods, and ritual were enough to protect it. Tonight, all of them had betrayed that faith. By morning, Troy was no longer Troy. It was rubble, a warning, a story that would later be told in cleaner, gentler versions, so that people could endure the memory. But Odysseus knew and would never forget. He had not only helped open the gates of a city, he had opened another door, one where men were willing to turn another people's faith into a weapon and call it necessary. That was the darkest moment, not because of the number of dead, but because of what had been proven: that a civilization could be destroyed without being defeated. All that was required was to make it step across its final line on its own. And in the gray white of dawn, Odysseus understood a cold truth. He had survived 10 years of war, but the price was that he had become an accomplice in the death of an entire world. When Troy was reduced to smoke and broken stone behind them, the Greek fleet left the shore in a silence heavier than the one that had marked their departure years before. There was no excitement, no promises left to keep. The war was over, but no one felt freed by it. 10 years of bloodshed did not close with victory, but with an unnamed emptiness, a void where every reason they had once used to endure had finally run dry. Odysseus stood on the deck, staring out at the endless surface of the sea. He knew Troy was dead, yet somewhere deeper he understood that his real journey was only beginning. There were no longer enemies behind walls, no clear target left to hate. There was only the ocean and men carrying things they could not discard: memory guilt and the habits of killing. The first island they reached had no weapons, no walls, no army, only low trees and a sweetness in the air. Its people smiled gently, offering the sailors strange fruit, soft and warm in the hand. No one forced them, no one threatened them, and it was precisely that gentleness that made Odysseus wary. The soldiers ate, then sat down. They laughed. They stared at the sea as if seeing beauty for the first time. Stories of Troy dissolved on their tongues, along with the sweetness of the fruit. No one spoke of home. No one asked when they would leave. They wanted only to stay in this moment without pain for as long as possible. Odysseus watched and understood at once what was happening. This was not magic. This was forgetting. The most powerful temptation for those who have lived too long in violence. Forgetting is not a weakness. Forgetting is a survival instinct when memory becomes unbearable. But if it continued, they would never leave. They would fade away here, without swords, without gods. He dragged them back one by one, tying them to the rowing benches amid tears and curses. They begged to stay. They called him cruel. Odysseus did not answer. He knew that if he allowed them to forget, he would forget as well, and if he forgot, Troy would lose all meaning. The deaths would become truly pointless. They left that island with hollow eyes cast backward, like men torn from the deepest sleep of their lives. The next monster did not lure them with kindness. It waited in a vast cave among towering rocks. There were no laws there, no community, only a creature living by instinct, without farming, without worship, without regard for oaths or honor. It did not hide its brutality because there was no one there to judge it. When Odysseus's men were trapped, when bodies were smashed against stone and eaten before the eyes of those still alive, every lesson of war suddenly became useless. Collective strength meant nothing here. Honor bought no life. Even courage only hastened death. Odysseus did not fight the creature with weapons. He fought it with an understanding of the lawless world he stood within. He gave it wine, a product of civilization it did not need, but still desired. He gave it a false name because in a place without laws, language was the only law that remained. When they escaped, it was not through strength, but through knowing that in such a world, survival depends on not becoming a target. But once the ship was back at sea, once danger lay behind them, Odysseus could not remain silent. He shouted his name into the darkness. He claimed who he was, not because it was necessary, but because he could not endure the thought of having won without being known. And in that moment, he opened the door himself to something else entering his life punishment that did not come from men. The days that followed passed in tension. The sea was no longer neutral. Winds shifted without pattern. Waves rose as if driven by will. Odysseus began to understand that he could defeat what carried blades and spears, but he could not bargain with the invisible consequences of arrogance. Then they heard singing, not songs of lust, not invitations of flesh. These were stories, stories of Troy, of what they had done, what they had lost, what they would never speak of once they returned home. The voices knew their names, knew the moments they had killed, knew even the moments they felt regret, and the moments they did not. The men trembled, not from fear, but from being seen. After 10 years of war, the most seductive thing was not forgetting, but being understood, hearing one's own story told back, as if everything that had happened carried meaning. Odysseus ordered their ears stopped with wax. He had himself tied to the mast. He wanted to hear but not to follow. When the singing rose, he screamed, begged to be released, promised anything. No one answered. The rowers could not hear him, and that was what saved them. When the song faded behind them, Odysseus was spent. He had won. But this victory brought no relief. Each time he overcame a trial, he realized he had paid with another part of himself. He no longer allowed himself rest, no longer allowed weakness. Every decision was made as if only one measure remained: keep moving. The monsters they faced did not come from the sea. They came from what war had done to men, from the need to forget from life without laws, from addiction to memory and meaning. Odysseus survived them all with his mind, with unbroken vigilance. But each time he felt himself drift farther from home, farther from who he had once been. When the next shoreline emerged through the mist, Odysseus understood that he was winning in the only way left to him, and he understood the cost. He was still alive, but the things that made him human piece by piece were being left behind, sinking into the sea, along with the songs that had finally gone silent. The sea opened before the prow like a wound that had not yet closed. After the songs had faded after the islands, where men could forget or be stripped bare down to their deepest memories. The air on deck grew unusually heavy. The wind still blew. The oars still kept their rhythm, but among the men a silence had formed that no one dared to name. They knew they were entering a stretch of passage that not all of them would cross. Odysseus watched the water change color. The current tightened, folding in on itself, as if the sea were twisting against its own body. He had heard of this place long ago through broken stories and vague warnings. On one side lay a whirlpool that swallowed everything whole, leaving nothing behind. On the other hand, a cliff face where something waited in the darkness. There was no safe path, only a choice. A cold thought surfaced in his mind, needing no words. A good leader is not the one who saves everyone, but the one who knows exactly who will not be saved. The thought carried no pride and no justification. It was simply a calculation. Charybdis lay to one side, the whirlpool wide and deep, each rotation like the breathing of something enormous. If the ship entered it, everything would vanish. No screams, no struggle, no story left to tell. A complete absolute death. Scylla waited on the other side, hidden in a high cleft of rock, revealing only brief, indistinct movement. No one could see it clearly, but everyone knew what would happen if they drew too close. The sailors looked to Odysseus. No one asked questions. They were used to him making decisions, and they were used to those decisions not always being explained. Odysseus stood at the prow, one hand on the steering oar, feeling every small vibration of wood and water. He knew that if he spoke the truth, if he said that, one way meant everyone would die, and the other meant only a few would be taken. There would be resistance, panic, desperate attempts to flee, and in that moment the ship would lose control. So he stayed silent. He chose the cliff. He did not say that 6 lives had already been counted in his mind. He did not say that he knew the price exactly. He put on his armor, took up his spear, and stood at the prow like a man ready to fight, as if strength still mattered here. It was the final performance for those who needed to believe their leader would stand between them and death. As the ship slid close to the rock face, the air changed. A sound tore through the wind, unlike anything they had heard before. Then shadows lunged out fast, precise without hesitation. 6 men were lifted from the deck, their screams brief cut short by jaws that did not belong to this world. Blood splattered the cliff and fell into the sea, thinning and disappearing as if it had never existed. Odysseus did not turn away. He watched. He heard every cry, every name shouted in hopelessness. He felt an invisible cord pull tight in his chest, but his hand did not leave the steering wheel. If he stopped, if he hesitated, Charybdis would finish the work, and then it would not be only 6. The ship emerged from the dead waters in silence. No one cheered. No one wept. The men who remained looked at one another, counted, and understood. Nothing needed to be said. The truth stood clearer than any explanation. They had been chosen to live, not because they deserved it more, but because others had been chosen to die. Trust died there before the bodies had even vanished. Not trust in the gods, but trust that the one who led them would always speak the truth. From that moment on, a new distance formed between Odysseus and his crew, one that could not be measured in steps or rope. It was the distance of unspoken understanding. He was willing to sacrifice them if necessary, and they knew it. Odysseus felt the weight of eyes on his back. He did not turn around. He knew that if he did, he would have to face a question he had no easy answer for. Would he choose differently if given the chance again? The question hung there without needing a reply, because the ship was still moving and the sea did not care about human regret. Night fell slowly. 6 empty places on the deck remained unfilled. No one sat there. No one spoke of the men who were gone. The silence stretched on like a sentence. Odysseus stood alone, listening to the water strike the hull, each sound steady and indifferent. He had made the correct decision by every calculation of survival. The ship was intact. Most of the crew still lived. But in that moment, he understood that every such decision left a mark. Not on a map, but on relationships that could not be repaired. He was still the one who led them, but from now on, he was a leader no one trusted completely. And perhaps he thought that was the true price of survival. Not the lives that had been lost, but the knowledge that you must continue the journey alongside people who know that if it comes to it, you will be the one who decides who does not reach the end with them. The sea finally released Odysseus like a predator that had grown bored with its prey. The ship drifted into familiar waters. The smell of land carried on the wind, a scent he once believed he would recognize even with his eyes closed. But when his feet touched the sand of Ithaca, no sense of return came, only a bitter strangeness, as if he were stepping into a place he had known only in an old dream. The land was silent. No one came to greet him. No voices called his name. 20 years was long enough for everything to change shape, long enough for a man to become a stranger in his own homeland. Odysseus stood there, disoriented inside his own memories, like an old man waking in a house that once belonged to him but no longer felt familiar. He did not walk straight to the palace. Survival instinct held him back. A man who had lived through Troy and the sea understood one thing clearly. The most dangerous place is not the battlefield, but the place where you believe you are safe. He went around, and at the edge of the road leading into the city, he saw Argos. The dog lay on a pile of filthy straw, its body so thin that bones showed through patchy falling fur. 20 years earlier, Argos had been a young hunting dog, strong and fast running beside his master through forests and hills. Now he was only a shadow, abandoned like everything else that had once belonged to Odysseus. But Argos knew. The old nose twitched faintly. The tail struck the ground, once weakly. Clouded eyes opened wide in a final moment of clarity. He could not rise. He only looked, and in that look, Odysseus saw all 20 years return at once: Troy, the sea, the dead, the decisions that could never be undone. He did not kneel. He did not touch the dog. He was not allowed to. The man standing there was not Odysseus. He was a beggar, ragged and nameless. One wrong movement would collapse everything. Odysseus turned away, clenched his teeth, and walked on. Behind him, Argos released his final breath. The dog had waited long enough. When his master returned, he allowed himself to die. If anything remained of the man Odysseus once was, it died with Argos on that pile of straw. The palace did not look as it had in memory. It still stood, but it had been occupied without an army. 108 suitors had turned the great hall into a place of feasting drunkenness and waiting. Waiting for Penelope to break, waiting for power to shift, waiting for the man they believed had been dead long enough to no longer be a threat. They had not killed the king with a sword. They had killed him with time. Livestock was slaughtered. Wine was drained. Servants were forced to serve. Each passing day gnawed away another piece of the estate. This was not a feast. It was a slow coup dressed up as a courtship to disguise its predatory nature. Odysseus entered the hall bent-backed in torn clothes, carrying the stench of a wanderer. No one looked at him for more than a breath. The powerful do not see what they consider beneath them. That was their first mistake, and their last. He sat in a corner eating scraps thrown like food for a dog. He listened. He counted. Who sat where? Who laughed loudest? Who drank the most? Who held weapons? Who left them leaning against the wall? Everything unfolded slowly, methodically. This was not passive waiting. This was hunting. Odysseus no longer sought recognition, no longer sought justice in any beautiful sense. 20 years had taught him that order is restored only when someone is willing to do what others refuse to do. He had not come to negotiate. He had come to end it. When Penelope announced the challenge with the old bow, the hall erupted in laughter. The suitors treated it as a final amusement before one of them officially claimed the throne. They tried one by one, faces flushed, forearms straining, but the bow did not move. That weapon was not meant for men of indulgence. It demanded memory of war, of discipline of hands, accustomed to pain. When the beggar asked for a turn, laughter rose again. It died the moment he took the bow. No rush, no display. A familiar motion, smooth as if 20 years had never passed. The string slid into place. The sound it made was dry and sharp, like a blade. The arrow passed cleanly through the line of axe heads. Straight, without hesitation. In that instant, the hall changed owners. Odysseus rose his back straight, his eyes cold. He fired the first arrow into the throat of the man nearest him, blood spraying across the feast table. No announcement, no warning. The suitors lunged for weapons, but the weapons were gone. The doors were closed. The exits are sealed. This was not a battle. A battle implies both sides have a chance. This was an execution. Arrow followed arrow. Men who had once mocked now screamed, slipping on a floor slick with blood. Odysseus said nothing. He worked like a craftsman who had waited too long to finish an unfinished task. Telemachus stood beside him, no longer the infant thrown into a plow furrow long ago, but a man who understood clearly: kill or be killed. When the noise finally died, the hall was thick with the smell of iron and lamp smoke. 108 bodies lay scattered, evidence of a mistake allowed to last too long. Odysseus stood among them, breathing steadily, his hands unmoving. This was not a victory. This was the restoration of ownership through violence, the only language these men had ever understood. The house had its master again, but it was no longer the house it had been 20 years earlier. And Odysseus, standing among corpses and ash, understood with absolute clarity. Some things once taken back can never be whole again. There was no triumph, no celebration. After the night of blood in the great hall, Ithaca fell into a strange state, like a body just past a burning fever. Everything remained, yet nothing returned to what it had been. The dead were dragged from the house like debris after a storm. Blood was washed from the stone, but the smell of iron refused to leave. Odysseus moved through his chambers, slowly, step by step, as if inspecting a fortress he had just retaken, not a home. Penelope stood before him, alive, silent, aged by time. They looked at one another for a long while, and in that gaze there was none of what the songs had promised. No perfect reunion. Only two people who had traveled too far, down separate paths, trying to recognize each other among the wreckage. Odysseus knew he had returned, but he also knew he no longer fully belonged here. The days that followed brought no peace. The families of the slain suitors rose up, demanding revenge, demanding justice for men they themselves had allowed to rot. Ithaca stood on the edge of another civil war, smaller, quieter, but no less cruel. Odysseus was forced to take up arms again, not to expand territory, but to hold what had just been reclaimed. In the end, it took the intervention of the gods to break the spiral. Peace was imposed, not built, and Odysseus understood that such peace never lasts. He tried to remain, tried to learn how to live slowly, to listen to the sound of soil, the wind on the hills, the familiar footsteps in the courtyard. But the sea had lived inside him for too long. On sleepless nights he walked to the shore, watched the dark waves strike the rocks, and felt the old restlessness rise again. The ancient prophecy still hung over him like an unremovable hook. To appease the anger of the sea, he would have to go once more far inland, carrying an oar like a foreign object, until he reached people who did not know salt. Odysseus left Ithaca quietly, not in flight, not in search of adventure, simply because he could not remain still. Those who survive too much rarely endure calm for long. He returned, then left again, then returned once more like a man unable to find rest until time itself placed him down. Elsewhere, far from Ithaca, a young man grew up on unfinished stories. His mother spoke of a man who was clever, dangerous, who came and went like a storm, a father he had never known. As he grew, curiosity mixed with resentment, not because he had been abandoned, but because there were no answers. He set out not to kill, but to give a name to the emptiness in his life. Fate does not require drama to do its work. When the strange ship reached the shores of Ithaca, Odysseus was old. His back is no longer straight. His steps are slower, but the instinct to defend territory remained intact. He heard there were raiders along the coast, and he did what he had always done. He took his spear and went out. No soldiers, no questions, just the reflex of a man who had lived too long by reacting faster than others. They met on the sand, unrecognizing. No faded glance, no sense of familiarity, only tension between two armed men, each believing he was doing what was necessary. They lunged at one another as they had in countless other fights, without thought of tomorrow. The spear struck, not a beautiful blow, not a moment worthy of song, just a wound in the right place, deep enough, fast enough. Odysseus felt the sand darkening beneath his back. When the truth was spoken, it carried no tragic collapse. Only the heavy silence of things realized, too late, the death of Odysseus was not a tragedy, it was a consequence. The consequence of a life built on decisions made where no good options existed. The consequence of paths taken people left behind, blood ties stretched until they broke. He did not die as a hero. He died as he had lived, amid violence, amid misunderstanding, amid what could not be repaired. There were no memorable final words, no lesson immediately drawn, only an old body lying on the sand and a young man standing there holding a weapon, unsure what to do with the truth now placed in his hands. The story of Odysseus is often told as a journey home, but the truth lies elsewhere. War does not end when you step onto shore. It only changes shape. It follows you into your house, into your sleep, into the way you look at others, and the way others look at you. It lives on in the decisions you make when there are no war drums left to drown it out. Odysseus survived war, sea gods, and monsters, but no one survives completely. Each time he passed through, he left a part of himself behind. And when he finally fell, it was not to some great enemy, but because the circle closed as it always does for those who believe they have escaped. All that remains is the story. And that story, no matter how much light is cast upon it, carries a cold truth at its core. Survivors never truly return. They only keep moving until they no longer.